Hi, everybody. One of these videos that tries to kind of explain some elements of the program, and this one is SWAD on the professional standards, which, depending on your generation, might be a Harry Potter film that never got made, or perhaps Sherlock Holmes, which might be a little bit more appropriate. So, roughly speaking, today I'm going to consider professional standards in social work, because I suppose we try to bring a critical element to all of these videos and our teaching and learning and so on. Then we'll do a bit about how the relevant standards map against each other, which is a bit tricky, not perfect, but I think we can make a reasonable go of that. And a few short suggestions about how to usefully map those standards with the apprentice, and maybe how you might use them in some other ways. So our experience in general, I think collectively when we think of standards, it doesn't probably fill us with joy. But of course, we can't really do despair in social work, can we? Uh, except occasionally. Then we have to work out how to pick ourselves up. So we have to do better than that. How do we make the best of these professional standards? What standards? Well, I'm quoting here from a recent book from Practice Education, but there's been a whole raft of standards. Some of you may remember back to the National Occupational Standards in 2002. There were a previous set called TOPS, but I kind of thought enough of the history lesson, stick to the 21st century. Then the Professional Capabilities Framework from what was then the College of Social Work, and then inherited by BASWA, who've updated them ever since. Well loved in the profession, I think, and got some distinct advantages. There was some reports about social work education that prompted changes, and these changes essentially said it should be more about what social workers need to know and what they need to do. And that was the initial knowledge and skills statements for adults and for children initially, and KSBs, knowledge, skills, and behaviors, and the apprenticeship standards have come along. The first go in 2018, but were updated in 2022, and we'll be looking at that a little bit more here. The Social Work England professional standards, most of the people watching this video quite aware what those are, and have to do a little bit of reflection in order to maintain your registration every year. And at the end there, I have the most recent version of the IATE, or in fact, as it's now called, apparently, the IFATE apprenticeship standards. Like, surely that's enough standards. Well, nah, let's add practice educator professional standards, KSS, for practice leaders, for child and family practice supervisors, for practice work, I can't even say it. It's complicated. Social work practice educators and adult social care. Employers, of course, there's local government standards for employers of social workers. And I haven't even put in the BASWA Code of Ethics. Never mind all the KSS for achieving permanence, social work, autistic adults, and on and on and on. So we're in a very crowded landscape. But, for our purposes, well, first of all, mapping of PCF, KSS, and SWEPS has already happened. BASWA did that. Nice, shiny PCF document. If you want to click on the link there, you can find that. But they did not include IATE. And I wouldn't give them too hard time for that. When they were doing that piece of work, apprenticeships were a relatively new phenomenon. I think they've developed quite a bit since then, but nonetheless, they were not included. Social Work England seem to be moving more towards the registration or perhaps the monitoring of students. Maybe, maybe not. But at the moment, they don't register students. Previous regulators have actually done that. So I suppose that's a watch this page. So really in brief, PCF, KSS, SWEPS already mapped. So what kind of landscape again? Sorry for using that slightly unfortunate term, but nonetheless, how do we use standards on the apprenticeship program? Well, the course itself has to be accredited by Social Work England, the QAA, and Kingston University. So there's a whole series of processes that it goes through with standards mapping all over the place. All taught modules, if you looked at what we call a module descriptor, which gives you the main headlines of what any given module contains, they're all mapped against PCF, Social Work England standards, and the IATE. So we have to do that. We update them periodically. Really, I'm just trying to make the point that their apprentices, specifically through the use of what are called learning logs, where they have to write what they have learned, um, are mapping standards not just on the job, but off the job in taught modules in the university also. So they're collecting evidence in a number of different ways. Um, PCF has one distinct advantage, really, as far as I'm concerned, and I think that's our general consensus on the course, is that there's a very clear progression through the levels, through pre and post qualifying levels. The other standards do not have those things. Education standards tend to have them because what you teach at year 1, 2, and 3, or levels 4, 5, and 6 are very different. And you have to have some sort of progression or a sense of developing over time. But the PCF is the only professional standard that actually does that. A little bit more about the PCF. I mean, it was developed by the profession for the profession, as they said at the time. Um, I don't know. I still think it's useful. It might disappear. Who knows? But at the present moment in time, we find it very useful for, I guess, helping the apprentices stay on track. Now, as a lot of you will know, some of you might not, there are levels in pre-qualifying social work education, and our course is mapped. We've changed this around a couple of times, but now, today, in 2024, it's mapped against these 3 levels. So in the first year, it's readiness for direct practice, which is a very basic level and something that our apprentices generally have no problem in evidencing. It also causes us to be like a little modest about what we're expecting from them in the first year, and also gives us an opportunity to get used to expectations in terms of evidence gathering, professional behavior, the processes of getting feedback, that kind of thing, and of course, academic writing. In year 2, level 5, it's end of first placement level, which has got an additional level of sophistication. And year 3, level 6, isn't far off what we would expect from an actual qualified social worker. It's much more sophisticated, much more detailed on things, in particular like reflection and practice. Whereas in readiness for direct practice, we just have to know and understand that this thing, reflection, exists and is important for social work. But by the time we come to level 6, it's far more sophisticated. It's kind of considering personal reflection, reflection and supervision, reflection on our work, and indeed with people with lived experience. It's a different order of things altogether. And you are no doubt familiar with the domains. These are broken down into various subdomains, but we need not worry about that too much here today. So we're kind of used to the color-coded fan. The kind of ones towards the left tend to be more individual and personal and about casework. And as we go over this other side, they're more about professionalism, leadership, and things of that nature. You get the idea. So what about the IFATE, as it suddenly has rebranded itself? It's interesting when organizations rebrand themselves and how much kind of effort goes into changing letterheads, and it must cost an absolute fortune, never mind the time. But anyway, so the IFATE is the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. That's a bit interesting, isn't it? Technical education. Well, I suppose when we consider a lot of providers of social work education, actually their background is in vocational education, technical colleges and things of that nature. And that includes Kingston, which was originally a teacher training college. So we are kind of vocational in our outlook. We're also a university. So we shouldn't be put off by the idea of a technical or vocational education. You can link there to the full standard, but basically it's broken down into, first of all, an occupation summary, and it's very much about a narrative. Social work as a profession, and it's very much an occupational take, saying who you work with, what kind of supervision, what kind of agencies you might work in, and things of that nature. It does have a little line about social justice in there. Interesting. The takes people have on this and what they emphasize and what they kind of de-stress, as it were. But, there you go. So there are occupation duties, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. There are 19 duties. I'm not going to list all the categories because I'm not entirely sure that we need to, but at the moment, just for the sake of our discussion, there's 19 duties, and these in turn are mapped against a large number of knowledge, skills, and behavior statements. So there's 35 things that a social worker should know, 50 things that they should be able to do, and 5 broadly professional behaviors that are expected of them. Oh, how to make sense of all of this? Without national guidance, there isn't any. We did ask BASWA and we asked other providers, but at the moment, we've had to kind of do our own thing. So we did. Like, when in doubt, do it yourself. But as you can see from this slight DIY disaster, we kind of, I suppose, we'd have to accept that it's not perfect, that there will be future versions of it. But I think it's good enough as a tool, a little mapping tool, to be useful to the apprentices in gathering their evidence. It's essentially an Excel spreadsheet, and there are 4 tabs on it. But we're hoping that particularly if you start with the PCF, you can use this as a tool, a bit like a logbook or something like that they used to have in maths in the last century. But you can use this as a tool to kind of find what KSBs, knowledge, skills, and behavior statements, map against the PCF. PCF is more straightforward, really, in that there's just the 9 domains. And we've done as good as we can, I think, at the moment, even though it will always be a work in progress. So you'd find the PCF because that's the first thing you're always going to have in your index of evidence, and you can kind of look up the table to find which relevant KSBs that refers to. Probably worth actually reading the KSB, but that's also supplied a full list of those in the spreadsheet. So the tabs, the first one's IATE and PCF. So that's the full knowledge, skills, and behaviors mapped against the PCF. The second tab is the duties. So you have a column with those, well, 2 or 3 columns, but in any event, with the 19 duties mapped against the KSBs and then against the PCF, if you see what I mean. So you have to do it both ways around. Sometimes the starting point is the IATE and sometimes the PCF. The third one, I think likely to be the most useful, is the PCF and then the KSBs. I kind of think that's probably going to be the most useful thing. As I say, there is a list of the KSBs, so you can go back another tab and you can say, does this match up kind of pretty well? Probably. There's an optional tab if people wanted to track their own standards. Just realized today during this presentation that probably needs a little bit more work. And I'll have a little think about that and probably talk to the students about it. So I think in general, if you start from the PCF, some learning opportunities or pieces of evidence, the temptation is always to put 1 to 9. And sometimes a piece of work can cover all things. Do you know what I mean? I don't know how good that is for evidence gathering. So what we generally suggest is when you're mapping the PCF, think of here's the learning opportunity or the piece of evidence. What PCF does it link most strongly to? And I think if we take that kind of approach, more likely to be able to use this as a useful document because it'll identify areas of strength and where we need to develop a little bit more. If you put 1 to 9, well, then really, potentially you could just end up putting all the KSBs. And that really doesn't seem to make much sense. So always look for where the strongest link is. So how might you use them? Well, as I suppose is self-evident, there's an element of realistic pragmatism here. It's kind of like we have to do this, so let's make the best of it. Well, but we could take it a little bit further. Again, as I say, start with PCF, then the IATE. In the final year, they have to just demonstrate that they have knowledge of the Social Work England professional standards. So I'm not going to cover that here today. We'll be taking that up specifically with the level sixes, but they don't have to map exhaustively, as it were. They just have to kind of indicate that they have an understanding of those standards, and we will do a class session about that. Again, I think the most useful thing is to identify strengths and areas for development. And you need both things. But if you're collecting a ton of evidence about strengths and ignoring the areas for development, that's really not quite working. So we can use it as a template for professional development. And I suppose really understanding standards, managing IT systems, managing information systems is part of contemporary social work practice. It doesn't matter what way you turn it, you're always going to have some element of this in your practice. Some would argue too much of it. I would have sympathy with that argument, but nonetheless, it's a realistic expectation that we might have entering into the world of social work. And just as a little kind of thought there at the end is hilarious, but Social Work England, of course, are in turn regulated by another body that oversees regulators. And naughty, naughty Social Work England, bad Social Work England. The authority published its performance review. This is 2021, so they've probably updated it since then. But they made 16 of 18 standards, and the ones they did not meet, they were concerned about the lack of EDI data Social Work England had on its registrations. And since we're a profession that seems to pride itself on our EDI practice, I don't know if we should, certainly not always. It quite interesting is that the regulator kind of didn't do that. And you kind of think, what? But anyway, standard 17 is about interim orders. That's about fitness to practice. And I'm sure you've seen some stuff in the papers about fitness to practice and social work in England. I suppose my point is even the regulator is regulated. It kind of feels like a bit of a hall of mirror at times. Reflective elements, I mean, if we're not using what's in our kind of environment in a reflective way, we're probably not making the best of what's in front of us. So I just add one little thing in here. This was Hilary Lawson. It's back in 2015. It's quite a while ago now, but I still think it's relevant and pertinent. And Dr. Lawson was suggesting that the PCF, this is a survey of staff, okay? This is direct work with staff and practice educators, people of that nature, that it prompts personal and professional development. It encourages professional autonomy. I particularly like that one. So, we need that in the profession. Aids professional development. I mean, that may seem fairly obvious, but also shapes practice. It kind of makes us think perhaps multidimensionally about the actual things we do in our day to day. And also, it was meaningful and, in fact, valued by practitioners and had a strong value base. Social work values were kind of written into the script. So you can follow that article if you like, but that's the basic kind of take on that. So I added a little thing here. There are so many different things that influence social work practice, and we're not always conscious of them, but standards are one of those things. There is a longer story behind each one of those about how they got here. I suppose we need not detain ourselves too long considering that, but that story is there. There's usually a belief system and an ideology or ideas about social work that inform those things. This little map here is done by Joe Hanley, who's a social work lecturer in the Open University. You can link there. This is a series of the social work magazines free to view that were done during the COVID pandemic. And he spent a bit of time, maybe a bit too much time, mapping some of the more recent arrivals into social work. You can see social work, the front line very much there. Um, at the center of it all. Some of those names you might recognize, some of them perhaps not. Teach First, some of the organizations, obviously DFE, things like that. But also in there, there are a few kind of waifs and strays, and you think, how did they get there? And I mean things like McKinsey and Social Finance and EYS and some of the hedge funds that might be kind of supporting some areas of social work. It's a complicated business, is it not? So, really, that's, I guess, all I really have to say about that. I know mapping standards is perhaps not people's favorite activity, or maybe I'm just displaying my own bias here, but it can be used in a positive way. And I hope that the spreadsheet helps to take some of the work out of kind of laboriously having to go through each standard. The idea of the tool is that's its function really, to kind of help you kind of fill in those two columns. But of course, it needs a little bit more thought through and perhaps a little bit of reading what is actually said behind the numbers. At the end of the day, it's all about professional development. And until the next standards update, of which there will no doubt, that absolutely no doubt that that's going to happen. That's the current picture at the present moment. I hope that's been of some use. And thanks for your attention and bye. See you later.